It is Mr. Hectic Shots here with some NBA 2K13, and I started an online association a couple days ago, and I decided that it might be a good idea to make sort of a drafting guide for those of you who are doing fantasy drafts on 2K13. And this sort of information is useful as well if you're going to be doing fantasy, not necessarily 2K13, although I don't know. This is mostly for a 2K13 fantasy draft. And just to tell you about the gameplay that's going to be going on in the background, it's the Pacers and the Nuggets. It's just a game I played from the NBA Today playlist for like the 28th of January. And without further ado, let me get on the topic of a fantasy draft. So this guide doesn't really focus, not really guess, this is what I would do, and I think it's very logical. It's not necessarily a play-by-play who to pick, but it gives you some ideas of the way I would set up my team, and I think it's a pretty good setup. So your first pick, a lot of people are going to tell you go for this player, go for that player. The way I see it, with your first pick, if you've got a first round pick, which you should, so top 30 players in the league, just pick the best player you can get. They're probably going to be your franchise centerpiece. They're probably going to be expensive. But just get the best player you can get. Rudy Gay might show up in the middle of the first round. Darren Williams might show up sort of high in the first round. So guys like that. If obviously you've got one of the first picks, take LeBron. Take KD if you really want to take KD over LeBron. The first round should be the 90s and the higher 80 players as far as rating goes. So your priorities after that should probably be in order if you don't have one of these. If your first pick falls under one of these categories, you can skip that and come back to it for your bench. But your priorities after your first pick should probably be a ball handler who can drive to the lane, someone like Russell Westbrook. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get Russell Westbrook unless it's top 10 pick. But after you get your ball handler, so your point guard, maybe even a shooting guard that can play combo guard, you're going to need shooters and defenders. So I kind of put those two together because it's kind of hard to decide. It depends on who's available at that point. If you have to choose between a shooter and a defender next. A defender, you're probably going to want at the small forward, a quicker guy. A shooter, maybe a small forward or a two guard. And then you're going to need to focus on rebounding too. And the reason that you focus on rebounding last when you're building your starting lineup is because a lot of the centers aren't as high, rated as high. So most people are going to go to the higher ratings first. They're going to pick a high rating guy. And you're going to get those centers that have mid-70s player rating who are good centers. The reason a center has a lower player rating than any other position is because they don't have an outside game, most of them. That's why their rating is so low. It's not because they're bad, it's just because that's how the rating system works. If they had outside games like other positions, they'd be mid-80s and, that sort of thing. So as far as a ball handler goes, Rondo's probably not going to be available. Any decent ball handler should do. I mean, make sure you get a guy that can drive to the basket, has a good layup and a decent dunk if you want a guy that can dunk. Make sure that you have good ball security on your guy. If he can shoot the three and drive, that's really good, like a Stephen Curry. But then again, like I said, you're probably not going to be able to get Stephen Curry other than with a first round pick. So afterward, you're going to want to focus on your shooters and defenders. Now, defenders are a lot harder to come by than shooters, so like I said, if you notice other people in the draft are taking defenders first, you're going to want to scramble and grab one because shooters are a lot more common. So a good defender, Iman Shumpert, he's a cheap one, he's pretty good. He plays the 2. You could have him at the 3 if you really needed to, but he's only 6'5". So another good one, Andre Iguodala. They both have lockdown defender, which are good. LeBron James is lockdown defender, but obviously, unless you have the first pick, you're not going to get him. So Shumpert and Iggy are good defenders at the 2 and 3 position. I'm not going to give you names of shooters simply because there's so many of them. You can find a shooter to use. Shooters are easy to find is what I'm trying to get across. Although, on the subject of shooters, 3-point specialists that you might want to check into if you're looking for a 3-point specialist, either to play in your starting lineup or come off your bench. Obvious names: Nicholas Batum, Danilo Gallinari. Gallo's overall rating is actually kind of low in this game. It's only around a 70, so you might want to bring him off the bench if you can get a better small forward. Nicholas Batum, pretty good three-point shooter. They're both good knockdown shooters. They can shoot off the dribble too. Some sort of unknown three-point specialists that you might want to try out: Chase Budinger of the Timberwolves. He only costs like $900,000, his contract. You can bring him off the bench easily. Chandler Parsons, he could start. You could bring him off the bench. He's cheap. He's only he's under $1 million a year, and he's a good three-point shooter. He could start. He starts for the Rockets now. And a lot of these players that I'm going to be giving you the names of are, the less obvious people to be picking. They're cheap because, in my opinion, the most important thing in a fantasy league is that you stay under the salary cap, because you can't make good trades. Basically, you can't make good trades if you're over the salary cap. So that sort of brings us to some players that you should avoid. I just want to throw in really quick. JaVale McGee, for what he gives you, paying $10 million a year for him, for what he gives you, being just his dunking and he doesn't really have a great post game, I would avoid him. Now, these other couple guys that I'm just going to bring up real quick, most people are probably going to disagree with me. Kobe Bryant, you're going to want to avoid if you can help it, because if you look at how much money Kobe's making, Kobe is making almost $30 million. That's almost halfway to the salary cap for most teams, or for all teams. With $30 million, you could pick up 2 or 3 great players, not great, but 2 or 3 above average players for the price of Kobe. I think you should look into that instead of taking Kobe. But if you really want Kobe, go ahead and take him, but you're going to have to build your team accordingly to get around going over the salary cap. Another guy similar to JaVale McGee, DeAndre Jordan, avoid him. For the amount of money you pay for him and what he gives you, being just as dunking, I don't really think it's worth it. You can get better rebounders, or just as good rebounders, for a lot less. And another guy, Joe Johnson of the Nets. He's kind of risky. He's rated a mid-80s, which is pretty good for a 2-guard. He's 6'7". He could play the 3 if you need him to. But like I said, he's making a lot of money, and it's kind of a risky pick if you want to avoid going over the salary cap, which is what this sort of guide is about. So, on the subject of staying cheap, going back to rebounders, some good rebounders, centers, power forwards. Rasheed Wallace, he's great because you can bring him off the bench. You could start him if you needed to. He can shoot the 3. He rebounds well. He's not making a lot of money. Andre Blatch and DeMarcus Cousins. DeMarcus Cousins will probably go in the first round either to a CPU or someone who's looking for a good center, because he's up there in center ratings. He might be the 3rd or 4th best. So you might not be able to get him, but he's cheap. He's 6'11". He rebounds really well. He can get he offensive rebounds very well. He shoots the mid-range. You can bring him off a pick and pop. Andre Blatch is very cheap, under $3 million. You'll be able to bring him off the bench or start him. He's got a good mid-range game. He handles the ball pretty well. These other guys, Kenneth Fareed, sophomore out of Morehead State. It's his 2nd year in the league is what I mean by sophomore. Great rebounder, even though it says he's only 6'7", 6'8". He's a really good rebounder, very cheap. Thomas Robinson, rookie for the Sacramento Kings, great rebounder. Gets a lot of offensive rebounds, so does Fareed. So those guys are good at power forward. And some other just all-around good players that you can get for cheap. Paul George, he can play the 2, he can play the 3. He's 6'10" in this game. You could even have him play the 4 if you really need him to. He's not very expensive. He's cheap. He's a very good player. But the thing about Paul George is he's probably going to go in the 2nd or 3rd round unless you grab him quick. Two other guys, Kawhi Leonard, I think that's how you pronounce his first name, I'm sorry, of the Spurs, probably going to go 3rd, 4th round pick. Harrison Barnes, also probably going to go 3rd or 4th round. Good all-around players that you can get for cheap. Some good centers, just to bring those guys out, and power forwards. As far as the power forwards go, Antoine Jameson of the Lakers, very underrated, seeing as he's probably overrated as far as 2K goes. He's got a good rating. He's a power forward. He's probably going to go 3rd or 4th round. Ersan Ilyasova, almost rated as high as Antoine Jameson. They both can shoot the 3. Ilyasova is more expensive than Jameson, so take Jameson over Ilyasova, but they're both good. They both rebound well. They both shoot the 3 very well. Anthony Davis obviously is cheap. He's a great rebounder, great shot blocker. And moving on to centers, DeMarcus Cousins, as I mentioned earlier. Nikola Pekovic, he makes around $4.5 million. Good center, rebounds really well. Not going to be as much as an offensive threat as Cousins, but a great rebounder. Other great rebounders for cheap: Anderson Varejao, J.J. Hickson. Greg Monroe is a good overall player. Larry Sanders is great off the bench. You can start him too. He's a great shot blocker as well. So I think that covers everything that I've written down. If I think of anything else, obviously I can add it to this video. I can make another video. But quick overview. First pick, get the best guy you can get. Your priorities afterward are going to be your ball handler, a shooter, a defender, and a rebounding. So good luck to you guys in your fantasy leagues. Good luck in your drafts, and I'll see y'all later. Peace out.